She showed up at his door with a worn suitcase, a folded apron, and more courage than most men he'd ever hired. He told her one thing: don't talk unless you have to. She agreed. What he didn't expect was that within 3 days, his dead silent ranch would smell like fresh bread and sound like laughter again. And that terrified him more than any Montana winter ever had. This is the story of a man who forgot how to live and a woman the world kept trying to make invisible. Stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The notice Gavin Mercer tacked to the post outside Dallow's Feed and Grain on a Tuesday morning was not pretty. It wasn't meant to be. Temporary cook needed. Harvest season only. Room and board provided. No extra conversation required. Inquire at the Mercer Ranch, 7 miles north on Coldwater Road. He'd written it twice. The first draft had more words. He crossed most of them out. Dale Sutter, who ran the feed store and considered himself an unofficial social coordinator for the entire Flathead Valley, read the notice over Gavin's shoulder before the tack was even hammered flush. No extra conversation required, Dale repeated, tasting the words like something sour. That's a real warm way to advertise, Gav. I'm not looking for warm, I'm looking for someone who can cook. You could just ask Martha Helling. She's been feeding half this county for 30 years. Martha Helling talks from sunup to sundown, and I'd rather eat cold beans from a tin. Dale pressed his lips together and said nothing else. He'd learned over the past 2 years when to push and when to let the man be. Most days it was the latter. Gavin drove back out to the ranch in his battered Ford pickup. The windows cracked, even though it was barely 50 degrees because the cab smelled like old coffee and something else he couldn't name but recognized. The accumulated smell of a space where only one person lived, ate, and moved through the same hours day after day without variation. He'd stopped noticing it months ago. It bothered him today for reasons he didn't examine. The ranch itself was functional. That was the word he'd settled on. Functional. The fences held, the equipment ran, the cattle were healthy. The fields were prepped and ready for the first serious push of harvest, which would begin in earnest within the week once he could pull together enough hands. He'd already spoken to 3 of the men who'd worked for him before: Hector Ruiz, who'd been with him 8 years, and the Calloway brothers, Brent and younger Todd, who were reliable, if occasionally loud. He'd need 4 or 5 more, and he'd have them by Friday. What he couldn't hire out was the cooking. He'd tried, the first harvest after Eleanor died. He'd done it himself. Worked 16-hour days in the field, and then come inside and opened cans and boiled things and eaten standing over the sink because sitting down at the table felt wrong without her across from it. By the second week, Hector had quietly taken over making coffee and eggs in the mornings, without saying a word about it. And Gavin had pretended not to notice because acknowledging it meant acknowledging why it had been necessary in the first place. He was not doing that again this year. He needed someone who could manage a kitchen, feed 8 to 10 working men 3 times a day, and leave him the hell alone the rest of the time. That was it. That was all. She arrived 4 days after he posted the notice. He was out behind the barn checking the hydraulics on the combine header when he heard a vehicle rattling up the drive. Not a car he recognized, a neighbor giving someone a lift from the look of it. An old Dodge that slowed at the gate and then turned around and left, leaving a woman standing in the dust with a suitcase and something tucked under her arm that turned out to be a folded apron. Gavin set down the wrench and walked over. She was in her early 30s, he guessed. Round face, brown hair pulled back in a practical knot, cheeks pink from the cold. She was a big woman, full-figured in a way that was simply a fact about her, the way the mountains to the north were a fact about the landscape. And she stood in his driveway without apology, shoulders back, one hand wrapped around the suitcase handle, and the other pressing that apron against her side like she'd carried it a long way. She looked him straight in the eye when he approached, which was more than some men managed. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Rosalie Bennett. I saw your notice at the feed store in town. I've been cooking professionally for going on 9 years. Ranch kitchens, trail crews, a boarding house in Billings for 2 of them. I can feed a working crew. I won't waste your provisions, and I don't talk your ear off." She paused a half beat. Much. He didn't smile, but something in his jaw relaxed slightly, though he'd have denied it. "You have references?" 3 written ones in my bag. I can also give you Dale Sutter's number. He knows people I've worked for in the valley. He studied her for a moment. Not the way some men studied women, measuring, calculating. But the way he looked at any new hire, reading for something harder to define than a resume. Steadiness. Whether the eyes moved too much, whether the hands fidgeted. Her eyes were level, her hands were still. "Room's in the back of the house," he said. "Small, one window. The kitchen's well stocked. I had Hector pick up dry goods last week. Crew starts arriving Thursday. I need breakfast ready by 5:30, lunch in the field by noon, dinner on the table by 6. "Understood." I wasn't joking about the conversation. "I know." She picked up her suitcase. "I didn't come here to talk, Mr. Mercer. I came here to work." He pointed toward the house. She walked in that direction without waiting for him to lead her. He watched her go and then turned back to the combine, picked up his wrench, and told himself that was a satisfactory transaction and nothing more. By 6 o'clock that evening, the farmhouse smelled different. He noticed it before he even opened the back door. Something warm and yeasty drifting out through the kitchen window he'd apparently left cracked. Bread. Actual bread. Not the dense packaged loaves he'd been living on for 2 years, but the kind that meant someone had stood in his kitchen and made dough with their hands and put it in his oven and let it rise. He stood on the back step for a moment longer than he needed to. Inside, the kitchen table had been cleared. He hadn't realized how much had accumulated on half of it: mail, and a broken halter, and a coffee mug that had sat so long it had become part of the landscape. And Rosalie was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in the big cast-iron pot that had lived in the cabinet under the counter for the past 2 years. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning around, because she'd apparently heard the door. "I found the pot in the lower cabinet. Seemed ashamed to leave it there." He set his boots on the mat. "It's fine. There's stew and bread. I'll have coffee on in 10 minutes if you want it." He sat down at the table. Just sat. Because it seemed like the thing to do. And because the alternative was going back outside and eating a can of something in the truck again, which even he was starting to recognize as a habit that was no longer about grief and had become something else, something smaller and pettier that he couldn't quite name. She set a bowl in front of him. Beef, potatoes, carrots, onion, something herbed that he couldn't identify, but that cut through the heaviness of the meat in a way that was exactly right. A thick slice of bread on the side, still warm. He ate. She moved around the kitchen, wiping down surfaces and putting things in order, not talking, occasionally making a small sound that wasn't quite humming. More like she was comfortable enough in a space to make incidental noise, the way you only did when you'd stopped performing. He didn't hate it. That bothered him, a little. "Stew's good," he said when he was nearly finished. Came out awkward. He hadn't offered a compliment out loud in a while, and the muscles for it were stiff. "Thank you," she said simply, not making more of it than it was. He finished, pushed the bowl back, and left the table. At the doorway, he paused. "Crew's arriving Thursday. Hector Ruiz knows the kitchen layout. He'll show you where things are stored if you can't find them." "I'll manage." "I know you will," he said, and then caught himself, because that was more than necessary. He walked down the hall to his room and closed the door. He lay on the bed with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. Thursday came with low clouds and the particular smell of cut grass and turned earth that meant the valley was ready, that the season had tipped from preparation into action. Hector arrived first at 4:30 in the morning, his truck crunching over the gravel while the sky was still black, and he stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when he smelled the coffee. "She's already got coffee on," he said to nobody, with an expression that suggested this was a minor miracle. Rosalie, who was cracking eggs at the counter, looked over her shoulder. "You must be Hector. There's a mug on the hook that looks like it's yours. The blue one with the chip." Hector looked at the hook, then at her, then at Gavin, who was standing behind him pulling on his jacket. "She knows my mug." "I don't know how," Gavin said. "I asked Dale Sutter," Rosalie said. "He mentioned you'd worked here 8 years. I figured you had a regular mug." She went back to the eggs. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Hector poured his coffee with the reverent slowness of a man who'd been eating toast and peanut butter for the past several weeks since his wife had gone to care for her sister in Missoula. He sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the mug. "I like her," he said quietly to Gavin. "She's temporary," Gavin said. "I know what you said." The Calloway brothers arrived at 5, loud and still half asleep, and complaining about the cold in the particular way that ranch hands complained. Not really complaining, just filling silence with noise the way horses shifted weight from foot to foot. Todd, the younger one, walked into the kitchen and stopped so suddenly that Brent ran into his back. "What is that smell?" Todd said, in the tone of a man who'd been eating gas station sandwiches on the road. "Eggs, bacon, biscuits," Rosalie said. "Sit down and they'll be in front of you in 5 minutes." Todd sat. Brent sat. 2 more men arrived over the next half hour. Pete Osgood, who was 60-something and had worked half the ranches in the valley, and a younger man named Clay Briggs, who Gavin had hired out of Kalispell on Hector's recommendation. They all found their way to the kitchen table with the same slightly stunned expression, the look of men who'd been eating functional food for weeks and had suddenly been reminded that food could also be something else. Gavin ate standing at the counter, not at the table, which was his habit. He watched Rosalie navigate the space, filling plates without asking who wanted what, learning preferences in real time, refilling coffee before cups were empty, keeping a running internal count of where everything was. It was like watching someone who knew how to work, not perform. Work. She never stopped moving. She also never looked flustered. He went outside before the others finished, because breakfast was done, and there was a day's worth of work waiting, and because he'd been watching her for too long. The first week of harvest was brutal. The way first weeks always were. The body remembering what it had forgotten over the winter, equipment that needed adjusting, the inevitable small emergencies that came with running machinery through fields of standing grain. A belt on the combine blew on the second day. One of the irrigation lines on the east field cracked. Clay Briggs jammed 3 fingers on a gate latch and had to work one-handed for 2 days, which put more weight on everyone else. Rosalie fed them through all of it. There was always something in the kitchen when the men came in. Coffee at any hour, a pan of something that reheated fast if they'd missed the scheduled meal, a bowl of apples on the counter that she restocked from somewhere without anyone seeing her do it. She learned within 3 days what each man ate and didn't eat. She knew Pete Osgood took his coffee so light it was barely coffee anymore. She knew the Calloway brothers could eat twice as much as anyone expected, and she adjusted her quantities accordingly, without comment. She figured out that Hector had a sore back and started leaving a rolled towel on his usual chair without saying anything about it. She did all of this without announcement, without expectation of credit. It was simply what she noticed and what she did about what she noticed, as naturally and continuously as breathing. The men adored her for it within 4 days. Gavin watched this from whatever distance he could maintain, which was never quite far enough. He caught himself more than once slowing down as he passed the kitchen window. Not stopping. He wasn't stopping. Just slowing, the way a person slowed near something warm when the air was cold. He'd hear her voice through the glass. She talked to the men easily, asked about their families, laughed at the bad jokes that ranch hands told on loop. And something in his chest would do a thing he didn't examine closely, and he'd keep walking. On the 5th day, one of the additional hired hands Gavin had brought in for the heavy part of harvest, a man named Vickers, passing through from out of state, who'd worked 3 seasons in Wyoming and had the particular confidence of a man who'd never been corrected, made a comment at the lunch table. It was not a large comment. It was the kind of comment that someone like Vickers would have considered harmless, offhand, a throwaway. He said it with a smile, looking at Rosalie as she set down a platter, and the substance of it was about her size and what a ranch cook's own eating habits must be. And 2 of the other men laughed because Vickers had that quality of making people laugh at things they wouldn't have laughed at alone. The table went quiet a beat after. Not dramatically, just the particular quiet that happened when a room recalibrated. Rosalie set down the platter. She straightened up. She looked at Vickers for exactly 1 second, not with anger, which he'd probably have enjoyed, but with the complete and level regard of someone who'd heard worse from better and was simply deciding whether this was worth her time. She decided it wasn't. She went back to the kitchen. Hector put down his fork. He looked at Vickers with the particular patience of a man who'd worked the same land for 8 years and earned the right to his opinion. He didn't raise his voice. "Don't do that again," Hector said. Vickers opened his mouth. "I'm not asking," Hector said. Vickers closed his mouth. He ate the food Rosalie had made. He didn't say anything else in that direction for the remainder of the week. Gavin had been standing in the doorway when it happened. He'd come in to check on something, some errand he'd already forgotten. And he'd heard the comment and seen the aftermath and then gone back outside and stood in the cold for a moment, doing nothing in particular. He thought about going back in and saying something to Vickers himself. He thought about the fact that he should have been the one to say it before Hector did. He thought about a lot of things. Then he went back to work, because that was what he did with things that required more of him than he currently had available to give. It was the end of the 8th day. The crew had gone to their bunks. Hector had said goodnight. The house was quiet. When Gavin came into the kitchen for a glass of water and found Rosalie still there, sitting at the table in the low light with a mug of tea and a small notebook she snapped shut when he came in. "Sorry," she said. "I'll go." "You don't have to." He went to the sink, ran the water, drank it standing the way he always did. "What's in the notebook?" "Just lists. What I need to order, what's running low." A pause. "Sometimes I write other things." He set the glass down. He didn't pursue it because that would have been conversation, and conversation was against the rules he'd set, and the rules he'd set existed for reasons that were still valid. They were definitely still valid. "You handled today well?" he said instead. The comment Vickers made. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a night wind moved across the eaves. "I've handled worse," she said. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't an invitation to sympathy either. It was just a fact, delivered plainly, the way she delivered most things. That doesn't make it acceptable. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." He stood there longer than he meant to. The kitchen was warm, the light was low. The house smelled of the day's cooking and wood smoke and something underneath it all that he recognized without wanting to, the smell of a house that had a person in it. Not just him, someone else. Someone who made it a different kind of place by virtue of being present. Eleanor had made the house smell like this. For 11 years, she had made this house a completely different thing than it became after. He went to the doorway. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He walked down the hall. He did not lie awake as long as he had in recent months. He didn't examine why. On the 9th morning, he came in for breakfast, and there was a small ceramic mug on the counter beside the coffee maker with a faded blue pattern around the rim. It was not the mug he used. It was not any mug he recognized from his own cabinet. It must have been hers, he realized. Something she'd brought in her suitcase. One of those things a person kept because they'd kept it long enough that it became part of how they moved through the world. She was at the stove, not looking at him. He poured his coffee into his own mug from the hook, same as always, and went outside. But he'd noticed it. He'd noticed that mug the same way he'd started noticing other small things. The window over the sink that now had a cloth draped across the lower sill to dry herbs against the glass. The chair by the back door that had a folded jacket on it that wasn't his. Small proofs of habitation, of someone else existing in his space. He'd spent 2 years making sure none of those things accumulated. He'd lived without them deliberately, purposefully, because their presence implied continuation, and he wasn't sure continuation was something he deserved. Now they were accumulating again, quietly, through no effort of his own. He stood on the back porch in the early morning dark and drank his coffee and watched the mountains take shape out of the gray. Somewhere behind him, through the kitchen window, he could hear her moving, setting the table, talking softly to herself, or to the food, or to no one in particular, the way a person talked when they'd been alone enough to stop requiring an audience. He finished his coffee. He went to work. The harvest was going to be a good one. He could feel it in the fields, the weight of the grain, the way the stalks moved, the particular density in the air that meant the yield was there, ready. He hadn't cared about a good harvest in 2 years. He'd done the work because the work had to be done, because the ranch had to sustain itself, because forward motion was a kind of survival, even when it felt like nothing. Standing in the north field as the light came up pink over the ridgeline, he felt something he didn't immediately recognize. It took him a moment. It was close to anticipation, not for anything specific, just the sensation of something being possible that had not felt possible for a long time. He stood there with it for a minute, letting it exist without shutting it down. Then he turned the combine over and drove it into the field and started the work of the day, which was the same as it had always been, and somehow, inexplicably, not. The second week of harvest hit the valley like a fist. The weather held. Barely. with the kind of cold, clear days that were perfect for cutting grain and brutal on the body, the sun bright enough to fool you in the morning, and the wind sharp enough by afternoon to cut straight through whatever you'd worn, thinking the morning was a promise. The crew worked from before light to after dark, and the rhythm of the ranch became a single continuous thing, a long, grinding machine of muscle and equipment and coffee and exhaustion. Rosalie fed it all. She was up before anyone else. Gavin had started setting his alarm for 4:15, which was earlier than he'd been waking, and every morning when he came into the kitchen, she was already there. Fire going in the stove, coffee started, something already in the oven or on the back burner doing whatever it needed to do without her immediate attention while she moved on to the next thing. He'd stopped asking himself when she slept. The crew had grown to 9 men by the second Monday. 2 more had come in over the weekend, brothers from over the divide named Santos and Ruben Flores, who were quiet and capable and ate more than seemed physically possible, plus a spare hand named Walt, who was somewhere between 50 and 70 and spoke mostly in single syllables but could fix anything mechanical with whatever happened to be in his pocket. 9 men, 3 meals a day, plus the mid-morning and mid-afternoon coffee that Rosalie started running out to the field herself, when it became clear that the walk back to the house was eating 20 minutes out of the crew's working day. She rigged a setup in the back of Gavin's old flatbed, an insulated container she'd found in the storage shed, a folding table she'd commandeered from the barn, a cloth she weighted on the corners with stones against the wind. She drove it out to where the men were working, set up the table in 10 minutes, handed out coffee and whatever she'd made. Biscuits one day, thick slabs of cornbread the next, once a pan of fried apple pastry that caused grown men to stop talking mid-sentence. "Where'd you even find the apples?" Todd Calloway asked, holding his pastry with both hands in a way that suggested he was concerned it might escape. "Back of the cold storage. Box of them behind the seed bags. They'd have gone bad in another week. I've been walking past that cold storage every day for 2 weeks." "I know," Rosalie said, not unkindly. "You weren't looking for apples." Todd ate the rest of his pastry without further comment. Gavin was there that day, the day of the apple pastry, standing slightly apart from the group the way he always stood. Not unfriendly, just separately, like a man who'd spent long enough at the edge of things that it had become his natural position. He watched the crew around the flatbed and said nothing and ate what was in front of him the same as everyone else. But he was watching. He watched the way Pete Osgood talked to her. Pete, who was not a talkative man by any measure, who communicated with nods and grunts and occasionally complete sentences if the situation demanded it, and who somehow kept finding reasons to be near the flatbed when Rosalie was there, telling her stories about harvests going back 30 years, about a drought in '94 that had broken 3 ranches, about a winter that had lasted so long the cattle had eaten the fence posts. Pete hadn't talked like that in Gavin's presence in the entire time Gavin had known him. He watched the way young Clay Briggs, whose 3 jammed fingers had healed enough to work full-handed again, followed her instructions about how to use the cast iron properly as if she were teaching him something he'd need his whole life, which she probably was. He watched the way Hector, his most reliable and least demonstrative employee, laughed. Actually laughed. The full version, not the contained acknowledgement that usually passed for it, at something she said while she was packing up the flatbed. He watched all of this from the outside of it and felt, for the first time in years, the particular ache of someone who recognized belonging when they saw it and understood on some level that they were choosing not to participate. He went back to the combine without finishing his coffee. So, the trouble with Vickers didn't end with Hector's quiet warning at the lunch table. Vickers was the kind of man who took a boundary as a challenge, not a guideline. He didn't say anything directly to Rosalie after that first incident. He wasn't stupid enough for that. But he had a quality that some men had, of being able to communicate contempt through absence of effort. He ate what she cooked without commenting on it, which in the context of a table where the other men made a point of acknowledging good food was itself a statement. He left his dishes in places that required extra work to collect. Once, on a Thursday, he tracked mud across the clean kitchen floor in a path that was deliberate in its leisure, and then sat down without looking at her. Rosalie cleaned the floor without comment. Gavin saw it. He was in the doorway again. He'd been in the doorway a lot that week. He was aware of that. And he saw the mud, and he saw her clean it, and he saw the particular set of her jaw while she did it, the way she was containing something. He went inside and sat down at the table. Vickers was across from him, eating. "Vickers," Gavin said. Vickers looked up. "When you come in from the field, you scrape your boots on the mat outside the door, same as everyone else." Vickers looked at the floor, then at Gavin. His expression did the thing men's expressions did when they were recalculating. Didn't realize the floor was so. "It's not about the floor, King," Gavin said. He said it without heat, which was worse than saying it with heat. "It's about how this house runs. Scrape your boots." Vickers scraped his boots from then on. Rosalie said nothing about it to Gavin. He didn't expect her to. But that evening, when he came in for dinner and she set his plate down, she met his eyes for a moment. Just a moment, an acknowledgement without words, and then went back to the stove. That was all. But something had shifted in the architecture of the house, in the understood rules of how this specific space operated, and both of them felt it without naming it. The work itself was going well. This was the part that surprised Gavin most. Not because he doubted his land or his equipment, but because harvests in his experience were always a battle against something. Weather, breakdowns, bodies that gave out, the simple mathematics of not enough time. This year, the same problems existed, and yet the whole operation felt less like a siege. He thought about why, over several days, the way he thought about problems with equipment, methodically, looking for the variable that had changed. The variable that had changed was obvious, and he knew it immediately, and spent several days refusing to fully acknowledge it. The crew worked better because they were eating better. That was a simple mechanical fact. Men who had hot food 3 times a day, who had coffee when they needed it, who came in from the field to a kitchen that smelled like something worth coming in for. Those men worked differently than men who were eating sandwiches they'd assembled themselves at 5 in the morning. Their bodies ran better. But it was more than that, and Gavin, who prided himself on seeing things plainly, made himself admit the rest. The crew worked better because there was somewhere to come back to, because the farmhouse had become a place rather than just a structure, because Rosalie had made it that without trying, the same way a fire made a room without trying. It was simply what it did by being what it was. He'd had this before. He'd had it for 11 years. He knew exactly how much it cost to lose it. That was the thought that drove him back outside and kept him there until the light was gone. On the Wednesday of the second week, the belt on the baler went, and the whole Eastfield operation shut down for 3 hours while Walton, Gavin, and Hector dug into it. It was the kind of repair that required more bodies than brains. Someone holding tension on one component while someone else worked a bolt in an awkward position. A third person waiting to hand over whatever tool was needed next. It was frustrating and slow, and it was 4 in the afternoon before the baler was running again. By the time they got it operational, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and the wind had picked up from the northwest in a way that Gavin didn't like. Not for today was fine, but it had a feel to it, a pressure, that made the hairs on the back of his neck pay attention. He looked at the sky going home on the flatbed, Hector in the passenger seat. "You feel that?" Gavin said. Hector looked north at the ridgeline where the clouds were doing something. "Yeah. How many days you think we have?" Hector was quiet a moment, doing the same calculation Gavin was doing. The feel of the air, the cloud formation, 20-plus years of reading this particular valley. 2 days, maybe 2.5 if we're lucky. We need 4. I know. They drove the rest of the way in without talking. At dinner, Gavin told the crew they were pushing 12-hour days for the rest of the week. There was the expected silence of men absorbing new information and deciding whether they had the energy to complain about it. Nobody actually complained because they all felt the weather turning, and because in that part of Montana there was a collective understanding that you took what the season gave you and didn't whine about the terms. "I'll have food in the field," Rosalie said from near the stove matter-of-factly, as if she'd already worked out her side of the equation. "Lunch at 12, coffee at 2:30. I'll keep dinner warm until you're in." Gavin looked at her. She was already refilling Pete's coffee without being asked. "That's going to make for long days for you," he said. "I'm not afraid of long days." "I know you're not." He said it before he thought about it, and it came out with more directness than he'd intended. Not a compliment exactly, more like a plain statement of fact, but the plainness of it made it land differently. She glanced at him, brief and precise, and then looked away. "I'll need to take the truck out again in the morning," she said. "Running low on a few things. I can be back before breakfast. Take whatever you need. She nodded. That was the end of it. But Hector, who missed very little and said even less, caught Gavin's eye from across the table with an expression that Gavin refused to interpret and looked away from immediately. The next 2 days were the hardest of the season. Gavin ran the crew through a pace that wasn't punishing so much as relentless. The pace of a man who understood what was coming and was calculating every hour against the weather, making decisions about which fields took priority, watching the sky at every break and adjusting. The crew matched him. Even Vickers, who was not an industrious man by nature, seemed to understand that the emergency had outranked whatever his usual posture was, and he worked. Rosalie ran the same pace. She was in the field twice a day with the flatbed, on time, every time. She managed the logistics of feeding 9 men under outdoor conditions with the same composure she brought to the kitchen, adapting on the fly when the wind knocked over the table on Thursday afternoon and sent paper cups rolling across the field, rebuilding the setup with rocks and a spare tarp she had in the truck bed as if she'd planned for exactly this. She didn't ask for help. She didn't complain. She handed out food and coffee and occasionally said something to whichever man was nearest that made them laugh or nod or just straighten up a little, and then she packed up the flatbed and went back to the house to start the next thing. On the Thursday evening, Clay Briggs was coming in from the west field, and he passed by the flatbed where Rosalie was packing up alone, and he stopped to help her lift the insulated container back into the truck. He was 23 and not naturally given to conversation, but he had the look of someone who'd been carrying something around for a few days. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She secured the container and straightened. "Sure. How do you—" he started and then stopped, looking for the right word. "You always seem like you're okay, even when people—" He looked uncomfortable. "Even when it's not easy." She considered him for a moment. The wind pushed at both of them and she pulled her jacket closer. "You think I'm always okay?" she asked. He hesitated. "You seem like it." "Clay, I got up this morning at 4 o'clock in a house where I'm a temporary employee, drove a truck in the dark to get supplies because I ran out of cornmeal, came back and made breakfast for 9 men, ran food out here twice, and I'm going to go back and make dinner now and do the dishes after that and probably get 5 hours of sleep." She folded the tarp methodically. "I'm tired. I'm always tired. Being okay and being tired aren't the same thing." Clay absorbed this. "Then how come you don't—" "I don't know. Show it." She lifted the last crate and handed it to him to put in the truck. "Because what good would it do?" she said, not harshly, practically. "The work still needs doing. These men still need to eat. Showing how tired I am doesn't change any of that. It just makes everything heavier for everybody." She latched the tailgate. "And I've been carrying my own weight a long time. I'm used to the load." Clay got in his truck and drove back toward the barn and thought about that for a long time afterward. By Friday evening, the storm was visible on the northern horizon. Not rain yet, but the kind of sky that meant it was only a matter of time, a dark mass above the ridgeline that had been building since morning. They'd gotten the east field done. The north field was 3/4. The west field had gone faster than Gavin expected because Pete and the Flores brothers had taken the second tractor without being told and started a pass on their own. After dinner, Gavin stood on the back porch and watched the sky and ran the numbers. They'd gotten more done than he'd projected. Not all of it, probably not all of it before the storm came, but more. He heard the back door open behind him and knew, without turning, who it was. Rosalie stood a few feet away, arms crossed against the cold, looking at the same dark sky. "How bad?" she asked. "Don't know yet. Could be a day. Could be 3. She was quiet. The wind moved through the grass at the edge of the yard and made a dry sound. "The crew did good this week," she said. "They did. You pushed them hard, but you gave them something worth working for." She said it without particular emphasis, like she was observing the weather. He turned and looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking north, at the ridgeline, her hair coming loose in the wind. "I didn't give them anything," he said. "You fed them." "That's not what I meant." He turned back to the sky. He knew what she meant. He wasn't sure he agreed, but he knew. After a minute, she went back inside. He stayed on the porch a little longer, listening to the wind build, watching the darkness gather over the mountains that had ringed his life since birth. Inside the house, from somewhere down the hall, he could hear her moving. The small sounds of the end of a day. Water running, a cabinet closing, footsteps that knew their way around by now. He'd spent 2 years making sure the house was quiet. Standing there on the porch with the storm coming and the harvest more than half won and 9 men sleeping in his bunkhouse because they'd shown up and stayed and worked themselves down to the bone. Standing there with all of it, he wasn't sure the quiet had ever actually been what he wanted. He wasn't sure what to do with that thought. So he went inside, the same as always, and locked the door against the coming weather, and went to bed in a house that didn't feel empty. He didn't sleep well, but that was different from not sleeping at all. The storm arrived Saturday morning at 3 o'clock, and it did not announce itself gently. Gavin heard it first in his sleep. A change in pressure, a sound building at the edge of hearing that pulled him up from whatever shallow rest he'd managed and put him sitting upright in the dark before he was fully conscious. Then the first real gust hit the north wall of the house, and the windows flexed and the sound went from a building thing to a present thing all at once. He got dressed in the dark, moved down the hall, and went to the back door. When he opened it, the wind nearly took it out of his hand. Rain was coming sideways, not falling so much as being thrown, and the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees since midnight. The yard was invisible past 10 feet. The barn was a dark shape and then nothing. He pulled the door closed, leaned his back against it, and stood in the kitchen doing the math. The crew was in the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse was solid. He'd re-roofed it 4 years ago, and the walls were thick. They'd be fine. The cattle were in the lower pasture, which had a natural windbreak on the north side from a ridge of ponderosa that had been there longer than the ranch. The equipment was in the barn or under tarps. The north field, the quarter they hadn't finished, was going to take some weather. That was just a loss to calculate after the fact. There was nothing to do right now except wait. He was still standing against the door when Rosalie appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a flannel robe he'd never seen before, her hair down and her feet in wool socks. She looked at him, then at the door, then at the window where the rain was loud against the glass. "How bad?" she asked. Same question as the night before, on the porch. "Bad enough, not catastrophic." He pushed off the door. "Crew will stay put till it breaks. Nothing to do in this." She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10 past 3. She went to the stove without a word and put the kettle on. He sat down at the table, which still surprised him every time he did it. The simple act of sitting at the table, in the middle of the night, in a kitchen that was occupied by someone other than himself. He'd forgotten it was something a person could do without it meaning anything in particular. Just sit. Just be in a room with another person. The wind hit the house again, harder, and something somewhere outside made a sharp cracking sound that made both of them look toward the window. "That was a tree branch," Gavin said. "Not the barn?" "Barn sounds different." He paused. "I'll check in the morning." She brought 2 mugs to the table and sat across from him, both hands wrapped around her mug, and they sat in the way people sat when they had nothing to perform for each other. The storm was loud against the roof. The kitchen light was the only light in the house. Outside was nothing but dark and wind and water. "You've been through worse?" she asked. "Few times." He turned the mug in his hands. "Winter of 2019, we had a blizzard that took out the power for 9 days. Cattle losses." He stopped there because the winter of 2019 had also been 5 months after Eleanor died. And the weight of managing that storm alone, the physical weight of it, 9 days without power and animals to keep alive, was not something he'd ever told anyone because there was nobody to tell. Rosalie was watching him with the even attention she gave to most things, not pressing, just present. He said, before he'd decided to say it, "Eleanor died in the spring of that year, so the winter was—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "It was a difficult winter." The wind drove rain against the window. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. Not the version of "I'm sorry" that opened into a series of follow-up questions, or the version that required him to manage her reaction. Just the plain version, which was its own kind of courtesy. 2 years and 4 months ago, he said. "Not that I'm counting." "People count," she said. "That's not a flaw." He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at her mug, and there was something in her expression that was recognition rather than sympathy, the look of someone who knew that particular kind of counting from the inside. "You lost someone too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The rain made a long, continuous sound on the roof. "My daughter," she said. "Clara." She was 4. She said it the way you said things you'd said before, when the saying of it no longer destroyed you on the spot, but the weight of it was still precisely where you'd left it, unchanged. Fever. We were traveling. I was working a trail camp cook job out of Missoula, moving east. She got sick fast, and the nearest town with a doctor was 2 days away, and we didn't make it in time. The storm pressed against the house. Gavin didn't move. She would be 8 now, Rosalie said. I count 2. The silence between them was not empty. It was the particular silence of 2 people who had sat with the same category of loss long enough to recognize it in a room. The specific gravity of it, the way it didn't go away, only became more familiar. Grief had a weight like that. Not lighter over time, just better distributed. You learned to carry it differently. You didn't stop carrying it. I didn't know, he said, inadequately. Why would you? She wasn't wounded by it. I don't lead with it. A brief pause. I don't lead with most things. He thought about that, about what it meant to move through the world, carrying something that size, and leading with your work ethic and your folded apron and your ability to feed 9 men without complaint. He thought about how much strength that actually required. Not the showy kind of strength, but the grinding, daily kind. The kind that never got witnessed because the whole point of it was to keep things functional for everyone else. She must have been, he started. She was wonderful, Rosalie said simply. She was 4. She liked apples and she hated hats and she laughed at everything. That's most of what I know about who she would have been, because she didn't get to be more than that. Her jaw moved slightly. You carry the person they were and also the person they didn't get to become. And the second one is harder because there's no shape to it, just absence. Gavin set his mug down. Eleanor was sick for 7 months before she died, he said. It was the first time he'd said that out loud to anyone in 2 years and 4 months. We knew it was coming. People think that makes it easier, that you get to prepare. It doesn't make it easier. It just means you lose them twice. Once while they're still there, watching them become less than they were, and once when they're actually gone. Rosalie nodded slowly. She understood exactly what he meant and didn't pretend otherwise. And then everyone tells you that you're strong, she said, because you kept going, because the ranch didn't fall apart, because you fed people or you worked or you did whatever it was you did to stay upright. The edge in her voice was not anger. It was exhaustion, the accumulated fatigue of being told that survival was the same as being okay. And you want to say, I'm not strong. I'm just still here. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said, they're not. The kettle had gone cold. Neither of them moved to reheat it. Outside, the storm was doing something to the yard. He could hear things moving, things shifting, the low, continuous sound of serious weather making itself at home over a landscape that had no choice but to accept it. The house held. It was an old house built by his grandfather, and it had held through worse. After Clara, Rosalie said, slower now, quieter, I moved around a lot. Couldn't stay anywhere. Worked 1 season somewhere and moved to the next. I told myself it was because the work was seasonal, which was true, but that wasn't the real reason. She looked up at the window. The real reason was that staying meant, I don't know, letting somewhere become home, and I'd had a home and I'd lost it, and I didn't want to do that again. Better to keep moving. Gavin said nothing for a moment. Is that why you answered a notice that specifically said the job was temporary? She looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not offense, more like surprise at being seen clearly. Maybe, she said, or maybe I just needed the work. Maybe both things are true. Maybe. She looked back at the window. I've been thinking about that, actually, the last couple of weeks. She said it carefully, like she was examining the words as she placed them. This is the first place I've been where It's different here. I didn't expect it to be different. I thought it would be like the other jobs. He waited. But the men here are decent, she said. Mostly. And the work matters. And the mornings are... She stopped. Then, I like the mornings here. That's a small thing, but I haven't liked mornings anywhere in a long time. He understood exactly what that meant. Mornings were the hardest after loss. They were the first test of every day. The moment before you'd remembered everything, and then the moment after, when it all came back. To like mornings again was a significant thing, disguised as small. I was going to drink my way through this winter, he said. The words came out flat, factual, without drama. Not, I wasn't planning it, but I could feel it becoming a possibility. I had the winter of 2019 and I managed because managing was all there was. But this year, before the harvest started, He pressed his thumb against the side of the mug. I was losing track of reasons. Rosalie looked at him steadily. Reasons to what? To do it right. To care whether it was done right or just done. He met her eyes briefly. You want your whole life to have had a point. And when the person who was part of what made it have a point is gone, you start... He stopped again. He was not a man who talked like this. He didn't have practice. The words were the right ones, but they came out rough, without polish, like something pulled up from a place that had been stored for too long. You start asking whether any of the effort is in service of anything real. The storm made a long sound over the house, a continuous deep note like the valley itself exhaling. I know that question, Rosalie said quietly. I asked it for a solid year after Clara. Every morning, what is this for? She paused. I don't have an answer. I don't think there is an answer exactly. I think you find something that needs doing and you do it. And then you find the next thing. And eventually the doing of it becomes the point, not what it's in service of. That sounds like settling, he said. Not combatively, just honestly. Maybe it is, she said. Or maybe meaning isn't something you find and carry. Maybe it's something you make, one meal at a time, one field at a time. She looked at her hands on the mug. I'm not sure I believe that completely, but I act like I do, and that's gotten me this far. Outside, a sustained gust drove rain hard against every surface of the house at once, and the kitchen light flickered, once, twice, and held. Both of them looked up, then back down, and something about the shared flinch of it broke the particular tension that had been building, turned it into something looser. The power might go, he said. I know where the candles are. Of course you do. She almost smiled. It was a different kind of almost smile than the one she gave the crew. Smaller, closer, intended for a smaller audience. He got up and went to the cabinet where the candles were, found two, set them on the table with a box of matches between them. He sat back down. When I posted that notice, he said, I was trying to hire someone to cook. That's all I thought it was. It was that, she said. I came here to cook. That's all I thought it was too. Neither of them said what it also was because naming it too precisely might disturb it, might require them to decide what to do about it, and they were both people who had been burned by things they'd decided on and lost. So the naming stayed incomplete, hanging in the warm kitchen air between them, while the storm raged outside and the candles sat unlit on the table, and the old house held its ground the same as it always had. They sat there for a while longer, an hour, maybe more, talking sometimes, silent sometimes. The storm didn't care either way. At some point, Rosalie refilled the kettle and made fresh tea, and he didn't say it wasn't necessary, because it was, in the way that ordinary small acts become necessary when two people are sitting in the same kitchen in the middle of a bad storm and figuring out slowly that they're not as alone as they thought. He told her about Eleanor, the real version, not the summary version. How they'd met at a livestock auction in Havre when she'd outbid him on a breeding pair of Angus and then felt bad about it and bought him a coffee to apologize. How she'd argued with him about fencing on the second date and been completely right, and he'd been stubborn about admitting it for 3 weeks. How she'd made the ranch a different place by simply moving through it with the certainty that it was worth caring for. How in the months she was sick, he'd slept in the chair beside her bed because the bed felt too large and wrong. And when she was finally gone, he'd moved back to the bed and slept in it alone every night since then, as a discipline, a refusal to let the loss rearrange everything permanently, and how most nights it worked and some nights it didn't. She told him more about Clara. Small things. The way she'd insisted on carrying her own plate to the sink even at 3. The song she'd invented about horses that didn't have a tune so much as a sustained enthusiasm. The way she'd fall asleep mid-sentence when she was tired. Words just dropping off like a radio losing signal. She told him about the day it turned bad, the speed of it, the specific helplessness of moving as fast as you could and watching it not be fast enough. She didn't cry, but her voice did things that weren't quite crying. He didn't tell her it was okay, or that time healed things, or any of the language people use to paper over grief, when they didn't know what else to do with it. He just listened. He let the weight of it be what it was. She did the same for him. By the time the sky outside had moved from black to the deep gray that meant dawn was somewhere on the other side of the clouds, the storm had begun to lose some of its force. Still loud, still heavy, but the sustained savagery of the early hours had settled into something more like persistence. Gavin was looking at the window when Rosalie said, "You've been carrying this alone for a long time." "So have you," he said. She turned her mug in her hands. Does that bother you, that I know this about you now?" He considered it. He asked himself honestly whether it bothered him, the way he asked himself honest questions about equipment and weather and the state of the land, without wishful thinking, without telling himself what he wanted to hear. "No," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it completely. "It doesn't." She nodded once and looked back at the window. "The storm's easing," she said. "It'll take most of the day to clear, maybe into tomorrow. Then we have time." He wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that, and he didn't ask, and she didn't explain. They sat in the gray early light with the storm going through its long diminishment outside and the house warm around them. And Gavin Mercer, who had spent 2 years and 4 months learning to live in a silence that was the specific shape of absence, sat in the kitchen that no longer felt empty and understood, without quite finding the words for it, that something had changed, not fixed, not resolved. Changed. The candles on the table sat unlit because the power had held after all. He thought that was probably a reasonable thing to notice. The storm left the valley the way hard things sometimes left. Not all at once, but in stages, grudgingly, as if it hadn't quite finished with the place and was only retreating under protest. By Sunday afternoon, the rain had thinned to a gray drizzle, and by Monday morning, the sky was the washed-out blue that followed serious weather in that part of Montana, pale and clean and cold. The mountains to the north looked closer than usual, the way they always did after rain stripped the haze from the air. The yard was a mess. Branches down, standing water in the low spots near the barn, one section of fence along the east pasture leaning at an angle that meant a post had gone soft. The north field had taken the brunt of it. Standing out there Monday morning with Hector, Gavin could see the flattened grain, the sections where the wind had pushed everything sideways. "Maybe 60% of what was left," Hector said, doing his own calculation. "That's what I figure." Gavin looked at it for a long time. "We'll cut what we can salvage. The rest we'll disc under." "That's a loss." "It is." He turned back toward the ranch. "Could have been worse." Hector walked beside him. "You seem..." he started, then stopped in the way Hector stopped when he was deciding whether a thing was worth saying. "I seem what?" "Different." Hector said it carefully, like he was placing something fragile on a surface he wasn't sure would hold it. Gavin didn't answer right away. They walked back across the wet ground, boots heavy with mud. "Storm was a long night," he said finally. "I imagine it was." Neither of them said anything else about it. That was generally how conversations between them worked, and both of them preferred it. What happened after the storm was not dramatic. That was the thing about real change. It rarely announced itself. It didn't arrive with a declaration or a moment of clarity that everyone in the room could identify. It arrived the way Rosalie had arrived, carrying practical things, and you only recognized it for what it was several days later when you looked back and noticed that the shape of things had shifted. Gavin started sitting at the table for meals. Not every meal. He wasn't going to pretend the standing at the counter habit had dissolved overnight. But breakfast, most mornings. And dinner, when the day's work hadn't run so long that he came in too tired to be civil company. He sat at the table with his crew, and he ate what Rosalie had made, and sometimes he talked, and sometimes he didn't, but he was there, present in the room in a way he hadn't been for 2 seasons running. The crew noticed. They didn't comment on it directly. These were ranch hands, not therapists. But the temperature of the dinner table changed. When the boss sat down, it meant something. Not authority exactly, but investment. It meant the work they were doing mattered enough for him to eat with them at the end of it. Hector noticed most of all, and said nothing, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 2 years. The other thing that changed was the farmhouse itself. It started with the front porch. Gavin had been walking past it for 2 years without seeing it the way Eleanor had kept it. The boards needed repainting, the railing on the left side had gone soft at the base and moved when you leaned on it. One of the porch posts had a split running down its length that had been there since the previous winter. He'd seen all of this and filed it as non-urgent and let it accumulate into the general background of a place that was being maintained rather than cared for. On Tuesday after the storm, while the crew was working the salvage cut on the north field, he went to the storage shed and found the lumber he needed, carried it to the porch, and started on the railing. Rosalie was in the kitchen. He could hear her through the open window. She had the radio on low, and she was moving around doing what she always did in the mornings, the practical management of a working kitchen. After a while, the sounds from inside stopped, and she appeared in the doorway. She looked at the lumber, the tools, and him. "New project?" she said. "Overdue repair." He drove a nail. "Railing's been soft for a year. Porch post needs sistering. I keep walking past it." She leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching him work the way people watch someone do something they were clearly competent at. Just watching. No agenda. "The front steps are a little soft, too," she said after a moment. "Second one from the top. I've been stepping over it." He looked at the second step from the top. He hadn't noticed. "I'll get to it." She went back inside. He kept working. He replaced the railing section, sistered the split post, and was down on his knee examining the front steps when he heard Rosalie come outside again, this time with 2 mugs of coffee. She set one on the porch railing within his reach and sat down on the top step with the other. He looked at the mug. He looked at her. "You're going to be sitting right where I'm working," he said. "Then work around me." She sipped her coffee. He worked around her. It was not as annoying as it should have been. "Can I ask you something?" he said, while he was prying up the second step. "You can ask?" "When you first got here, what did you think of the place?" She was quiet for a moment. "Honest answer? I'm not asking for any other kind." "I thought it looked like a place that had given up on itself," she said. "Not the working parts. The fences, the equipment, those were all fine. But the house, the yard, the porch." She looked out at the yard where the leaves she'd been meaning to mention were piled against the fence in wet clumps. It looked like someone was keeping the engine running but had stopped caring whether anyone wanted to ride. He thought about that while he pried the bad board free. "That's accurate," he said. "I know." She turned the mug in her hands. "I've seen it before. Places where something happened and the place became a container for the absence of it rather than a home anymore." She paused. "My grandmother's house was like that after my grandfather died. She kept it perfectly clean. Perfectly. But nothing new ever entered it. She stopped buying anything. Stopped planting in the garden. Kept everything exactly as it had been, as long as she could. And then she died, and the house got sold, and whoever bought it had to gut the whole thing because nothing had been updated in 15 years. Gavin set down the pry bar. He picked up the new board. "I'm not gutting anything," he said. I didn't say you were." A small pause. "I'm saying you're fixing the porch." He fitted the board into place. "I'm fixing the porch." She finished her coffee and went back inside. He worked for 2 more hours, and when the crew came in for lunch, the front porch had a new railing section, a solid post, and 2 new steps. Pete Osgood walked up to the house and put both hands on the new railing and gave it a solid test shake. "That's good work," Pete said, with the definitive brevity of a man who'd seen enough bad work to recognize the other kind. Gavin washed his hands at the outdoor tap and said nothing, but he looked at the porch for a moment before he went inside, and the looking was a different kind from the not seeing he'd been doing for 2 years. The salvage operation on the north field took 3 days. It was grinding work. The flattened grain had to be cut carefully, the angles all wrong for the equipment, requiring adjustments and patience and more than one manual pass on the worst sections. The crew did it without complaint, mostly because they'd been fed well enough for 2 weeks that they had reserves of goodwill to draw on, and partly because the nature of ranch work was that you did what the situation required, and complaining about the situation didn't change it. Vickers left on Wednesday. He didn't make a scene. He came to Gavin after the morning cut and said he had another job offer further south that he needed to take, which was possibly true and possibly not. But either way, Gavin paid him what he was owed in cash, shook his hand with professional neutrality, and watched him drive away without regret from either party. The crew's reaction to Vickers leaving was measured and contained. Nothing was said directly, But dinner that evening had an easier quality to it, a looseness, the particular atmosphere of a table that had been carrying a low-grade tension it hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. Didn't like him much, Todd Calloway said, to no one in particular, about 10 minutes into dinner. He's gone, Hector said, which closed the topic. Rosalie said nothing about it, but she'd made a peach cobbler for dessert, real cobbler, with canned peaches she'd found in the pantry and a proper biscuit crust. And the appearance of dessert, which had not happened before, was noted by every man at the table as a thing that required no explanation and received none. Clay Briggs had 3 servings. "This is the best thing I've eaten since I was 12 years old," Clay said, in the voice of a man making a sincere testimony. "Your mother cooked better than this," Rosalie said. "Probably," Clay agreed. "But she's in Kalispell and you're here, so you win on proximity." The table laughed. Even Gavin, at the end of the table, made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, brief and a little rusty, like something being started after a long time in storage. Rosalie looked at him from across the table. He looked back. Neither of them said anything, and the conversation moved on, and the dinner continued. But the moment had happened, and both of them had been in it. What? The thing Gavin hadn't anticipated, couldn't have anticipated, he thought, was what it did to the crew to watch him change. It wasn't something they would have put into words, most of them. Ranch hands were not, as a group, given to analyzing the emotional climate of their workplace. But there was a thing that happened on a ranch when the person who owned it was all the way present. Not just operationally present, overseeing and directing, but actually invested in what the place was and what it could be. When that happened, the work felt different. It had a weight to it that routine labor didn't have, a sense that what you were doing was building something rather than maintaining something, and building was always more sustaining than maintenance. Gavin had been maintaining for 2 years. In the days after the storm, he was doing something else. He was out in the salvage field with the men rather than directing from the margins. He was taking the harder sections himself instead of assigning them. He fixed the fence post that had gone soft in the storm without waiting to schedule it. He found the split in the barn wall that the weather had widened and patched it properly, not with the temporary fix he'd been renewing every season. One morning, he was in the barn before anyone else, reorganizing the tool storage in a way that had been irritating him for 3 years and that he'd never done anything about. Hector found him in there at 6 in the morning, moving a rack of equipment that had been in the wrong place since 2021. "What's happening?" Hector said. "Reorganizing." "I can see that." Hector leaned against the door frame and watched. "You've been saying that rack was in the wrong place for 3 years." "I know." "What changed?" Gavin moved the rack. It sat better in the new position. Everything about the barn's workflow would be slightly easier now. Something small and correct. "I got tired of walking past things that needed doing," he said. Hector was quiet for a moment. "That's good," he said. "That's a good thing to get tired of." They worked the rest of the morning without talking about it further, but Hector, who'd been quietly worried about Gavin in the way a loyal person worried about someone who refused to be worried about, felt the knot in his chest loosen another degree. It was Pete Osgood who said it out loud, though not to Gavin. He said it to Rosalie on a Thursday afternoon when she was at the flatbed and the rest of the crew was still in the field, and Pete had come in early with a sore knee that had been giving him trouble since the cold snap. She'd poured him coffee, and he'd sat on the tailgate, and after a moment he'd said without looking at her, "You know what you've done to this place." She looked at him. "I cooked," she said. "That's not what I mean." He held his mug in both hands, the way old men held things when they were talking about something they meant. "I worked for Gavin Mercer 3 seasons before this one. Knew him before that, from around the valley. He wasn't always—" Pete stopped. Searched for the right word with the patience of a man who didn't rush words. "He wasn't always like he's been? After Eleanor. The ranch got kept up, but the man inside it got smaller. And I watched it happen, and I didn't know what to do about it, because some things you can't do anything about." He looked out at the field. "Then you showed up with that apron, and inside a week it was different. I don't know how you did it exactly." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do it," she said. "It was already in him. It just needed somewhere to go." Pete looked at her sideways. "That's generous." "It's accurate." She packed up the remaining cups. He fixed the porch. "I saw." He reorganized the barn. He's been in the field with the men every day this week. He's sitting at the dinner table. She folded the cloth. None of that is me. That's him deciding to come back. Pete drank his coffee and thought about that. Still, he said, something got it started. She didn't argue with him because she was tired and because arguing with Pete Osgood was like arguing with weather. He'd let you make your point, and then the weather would do what it was going to do anyway. How's the knee? She asked. Terrible. I'll wrap it after dinner if you want. I'd appreciate that. He got off the tailgate slowly, favoring the knee, and looked at her with the directness of an old man who'd lived long enough to say true things plainly. I hope you stay, he said. Not my business. I know that. But I hope it. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to keep entirely internal. Thank you, Pete, she said. Quietly. He nodded and walked back toward the barn. She watched him go and then looked out at the field for a long moment, and her expression did the thing it sometimes did when she thought no one was watching. It became less managed, more complicated, the face of a woman who was carrying something she hadn't yet decided what to do with. The harvest finished on a Friday. Not triumphantly. There was no moment where a final bale came off the last field and the crew threw their hats in the air. Real harvests didn't end like that. They ended the way this one did. Hector drove the last loaded wagon to the storage barn at 4 p.m, and Gavin walked the north field one final time, checking the stubble and the numbers in his head. And the men came in and washed up and sat down to dinner, knowing the season's major work was done. It had been a good harvest. Not perfect. The storm had taken real losses from the north field, and there'd been mechanical costs and labor hours that would take some calculating to understand fully. But the numbers were good. Better than the previous 2 seasons, which had themselves been adequate. The yields from the east and west fields were the strongest in 5 years. Gavin sat at the table that night. The full table, all 9 men, the last night they'd all be together. And he didn't make a speech because he was not a speech-making man, but he said what he needed to say. This was a hard season, and you all worked it well, he said, simply. I'll have final payments in the morning. Anyone who wants a reference, see me before you go. That was it. But Hector raised his coffee mug, and the others followed, and that was all the ceremony the moment needed. After dinner, after the crew had drifted to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Gavin stayed at the table with his coffee. Rosalie was cleaning up, moving through the kitchen in the way she moved, efficiently, thoroughly, without hurry. The radio was off. The only sounds were water and dishes and the particular settling sounds of an old house at the end of a long day. He turned the mug in his hands. Rosalie. She turned from the sink. This was the best harvest this ranch has had in 5 years, he said. The yield numbers, the crew, the way the operation ran. He paused, because the next part was harder. That didn't happen despite who was in this kitchen. It happened because of it. She dried her hands on a dish towel slowly. The men worked hard, she said. You made it possible for them to. He met her eyes. You made it possible for a lot of things. The kitchen was very quiet. I was hired to cook, she said, but gently, without force, as if she wasn't quite arguing and wasn't quite not. I know what you were hired to do. He set down the mug. I know what this was supposed to be. Outside, the night was clear and cold, and the Montana stars were the kind you only saw when the air had been completely washed clean by weather. They were both aware of it somehow, the clarity of the night outside the walls, the distance between what this had started as and what it had become. He didn't say anything else that night. Neither did she. But the conversation had moved to a place it hadn't been before, right to the edge of something, standing there, not yet stepping through. He went to bed. She finished the dishes. The ranch sat under the clean sky, quiet and whole and ready for whatever came next. The morning after the harvest ended, Rosalie began packing. She didn't make an announcement about it. She simply woke before dawn the way she always did, made coffee, stood in the kitchen for a long moment with her mug in both hands, looking at the room the way a person looked at something they were trying to memorize, and then went to her room and began the quiet work of returning her life to the worn suitcase she'd arrived with. It didn't take long. That was the thing about a life built for moving. It packed efficiently. The flannel robe, the wool socks, the small notebook with its lists and the other things she wrote in it, the ceramic mug with the faded blue pattern that she'd kept on the counter beside the coffee maker because it was hers, and she'd carried it long enough that setting it down somewhere felt like a small act of belonging, even temporary belonging. She wrapped it in a shirt and set it in the suitcase and pressed it flat. The folded apron went last, on top of everything. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment after the suitcase was closed. The room was small, the one window facing east, and the early light was coming in pale and thin and cold, the way October light came in that part of Montana. She'd gotten used to this window, the way the light moved across the floor in the morning, the particular sound the wind made against the glass when it came from the north. Small things. The kind of things you didn't think you were collecting until you had to leave them behind. She picked up the suitcase and carried it to the hallway. But the crew was leaving in stages through the morning. The Calloway brothers were first. Always first because Brent had a standing policy of getting on the road before anyone else could ask him to do one final thing. He loaded his truck with the efficient speed of a man who'd been doing this for years. Thrown bag in the cab, sleeping roll in the bed, done. Todd was slower, said his goodbyes to everyone individually with the particular warmth of a young man who hadn't yet learned to be guarded about it. He shook Gavin's hand. He hugged Rosalie, briefly and sincerely, and said, "Best cooking I've ever had on a job. Not even close." And Rosalie said, "Don't tell your mother." And Todd laughed and got in the truck. Santos and Ruben Flores left together, quiet as they'd come, nodding to Gavin and lifting a hand toward Rosalie from the truck window. Walt, the man of few words and universal mechanical competence, stopped at the kitchen door and said, "Good season," to the general air, and then got in his truck and drove away. Clay Briggs took the longest. He stood in the yard with his bag and looked at the ranch the way young men looked at places they'd worked when they were trying to decide whether a place had gotten into them or they'd simply passed through it. He came and found Rosalie in the kitchen, where she was cleaning the stovetop for the last time with the thoroughness she brought to everything, as if the person who came after her deserved to find it right. "I wanted to say something," Clay said. She looked up. "What you said to me, by the flatbed that day." He shifted his weight. "About being tired and being okay, not being the same thing. I've been thinking about it a lot." "You have a good long drive to keep thinking about it," she said, not unkindly. "I'm going to." He paused. "I hope things work out for you, Rosalie, whatever that looks like." She looked at him for a moment. This 23-year-old man with jammed fingers healed and a season's worth of real work in his body, and a piece of something that would probably stay with him whether he knew what to do with it or not. "Take care of yourself, Clay," she said, "and call your mother." He smiled and went outside and drove away. Pete Osgood left mid-morning with more ceremony than he'd have admitted to wanting. He shook Gavin's hand for a long time, both of them gripping without shaking, the way old men express things they didn't have the right vocabulary for. He went to Rosalie last, and he said nothing at all, just put one weathered hand on her shoulder for a moment, and she put her hand over his, and they stood like that briefly, and then he got in his truck. She watched him go from the porch. Hector was the last. He'd already said what needed saying to Gavin. They'd stood together by the barn that morning and talked about the next season, equipment maintenance, what the winter would require, the way they always talked at the end of harvest, which was also the way they began the next season before it arrived. Practical things. Forward-looking things. Gavin had offered him the winter maintenance work, same as every year, and Hector had taken it, same as every year, and they'd shaken hands on it. Before he got in his truck, Hector went to find Rosalie. She was on the porch, still watching the road where Pete's truck had gone. Hector stood beside her. "You packed," he said, noticing her suitcase by the front door. "Job's done." He was quiet for a moment, then, "He's not good at this. You know that, right? Saying things. Going after things." He looked out at the yard. "He went 8 years without fixing that porch railing. He's not fast. At the personal stuff." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "But he fixed the porch," Hector said. "That's not nothing for him." She looked at the new railing section, the solid post, the 2 replaced steps. She'd walked up and down those steps 100 times since he'd fixed them. She'd noticed every single time. "I know that too," she said quietly. Hector nodded. He'd said what he came to say. He picked up his bag, got in his truck, and drove down Coldwater Road until the dust settled and the ranch was quiet for the first time in 3 weeks. The silence was different from the silence Gavin had been living in for 2 years. That silence had been the silence of absence, of a house that had once held more and now held less, a quiet that was defined by what it was missing. This was the silence of a place that had been full and now had the particular held breath of something waiting. Gavin felt the difference immediately and completely, standing in the yard after Hector's truck disappeared, listening to the ranch settle around him. He turned and looked at the house. Rosalie's suitcase was by the front door. He'd known she was going to do this. He'd known since the night he'd said what he'd said at the dinner table, that the harvest's success wasn't despite who was in the kitchen, but because of it. And she'd deflected it and gone to bed, and he'd gone to bed, and he'd lain there in the dark and had the long argument with himself that he'd been having in various forms for the better part of 3 weeks. The argument went like this. She came to work. She'll leave when the work is done. That was the arrangement. She didn't come here for anything else, and you have no right to expect anything else. And the last thing a woman like that needs is a man who can't even say what he means without 2 weeks of approach and retreat. The counter-argument went like this. She's still here. She hadn't left at dawn. She hadn't asked for a ride to town last night. She'd made coffee this morning and stood in the kitchen and looked at it. She was still here at 10 in the morning with her suitcase by the door, and she was still here, and he was standing in the yard not going inside, and at some point one of them had to move. He went inside. She was in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen. It was where she'd spent most of the last 3 weeks, and habits didn't dissolve overnight. And she was cleaning the stovetop even though it didn't need cleaning because she'd cleaned it last night after dinner. He stood in the doorway and watched her do this for a moment. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She kept doing it. He came into the kitchen and pulled out his chair and sat down, which was new. Sitting down in the morning, not at breakfast time, just sitting because he needed to be in the same room as the conversation he was about to attempt. He put both hands flat on the table. You're planning to leave today, he said. She stopped cleaning the stovetop. She set down the cloth and turned around, leaning against the counter with her arms folded, looking at him with the level steadiness she brought to most things. The job's done, she said. Harvest is over. I know when the harvest is over. Then you know the arrangement. I know what the arrangement was, he said. I'm asking if it has to stay what it was. She looked at him. Outside, the wind moved across the yard and the new porch railing held steady against it. Gavin, she said, and the use of his first name, she'd been calling him Mr. Mercer since she arrived, consistently, and the shift was not accidental. Don't say something because I'm about to leave and it feels urgent. That's not a good reason to say things. I know that. He pressed his palms flat against the table. I've been sitting on this for 2 weeks because I didn't want to say it out of urgency. I wanted to say it because it was true. He looked at her. It's both, right now. But it's been true longer than it's been urgent. She unfolded her arms. Her expression was doing the thing it did when she was paying very close attention. Slightly stilled, eyes clear, the performance of composure turned off so that the actual person behind it was present. You don't know me well enough, she said, not as a rejection, as a fact being examined. I know what you did in a storm at 3 in the morning, he said. I know what you told me that night about Clara. I know that you cleaned the kitchen floor when Vickers tracked mud across it and didn't say a word to him about it, not because you were afraid of him, but because you chose your battles. I know that you made a peach cobbler the day he left. He stopped. That's not nothing. That's 3 weeks, she said. I'm not proposing 3 weeks, he said. I'm proposing more than 3 weeks. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere outside, a bird made a sound in the cold air. What are you proposing exactly? She said, carefully. He ran his hand across the back of his neck, the gesture of a man who'd had this conversation rehearsed and was now abandoning the rehearsal because the rehearsal wasn't adequate to the actual moment. I'm asking you to stay, he said, not as a temporary cook, not as a seasonal hire. I'm asking you to stay on this ranch as, he looked for the word, the right word, not the easy one, as the person I want to build something with, going forward, whatever that takes and however long it takes to figure out what it looks like. He met her eyes. I know that's not a small ask. I know you've been moving a long time, and I'm not sure staying is a thing you trust anymore. I'm asking you to try it here. The silence lasted long enough that he could hear his own heartbeat. Rosalie looked at the table. She looked at the stovetop she'd just cleaned. She looked at the window over the sink where her cloth was still draped across the lower sill, where it had been since her second day here, where she'd put it because it was practical and because it felt like a small act of existing in a space and making it slightly more her own. "I'm afraid of this," she said, plainly. "I know. I don't mean I'm not afraid of you. I mean, I'm afraid of—" She pressed her lips together, finding the words. "I stopped staying places because staying meant caring what happened to them. And caring what happened to places meant caring what happened to people. And I know what it costs when those people go. I know exactly what that costs, and I don't—" She stopped. "I know what it costs too," he said. "Then you know why it's not simple. Nothing about this is simple." He kept his voice level. "I'm not asking for simple. I spent 2 years choosing simple. Simple is living alone in a house that smells like nothing and eating beans out of a can over the sink and not fixing the porch railing for a year after it needs it because the porch railing doesn't matter when nothing matters." He paused. "I don't want simple anymore. I want difficult and real, and I want it with you specifically, not with the idea of someone. With you." Rosalie looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Clara. She always thought about Clara in moments like this. Not with the raw devastation of the early years, but with the particular ache of carrying someone who was gone. The weight that had become so familiar, it was almost like a hand held rather than a wound. She thought about what Clara would have been at 8, whether she'd still have hated hats, whether she'd have liked this kitchen, this ranch, the mountains to the north. She thought about her grandmother's house, stripped clean of everything new, held in amber around an absence. She thought about what she'd said to Clay Briggs by the flatbed. Being okay and being tired aren't the same thing. She'd been tired for 4 years. She'd been managing the tired and calling it being okay and moving from place to place and doing the work and being good at the work and never quite answering the question underneath everything, which was, is this going to be all of it? Just this? Just moving and working and caring and moving again? Is that the whole shape of the life? She'd asked herself that question somewhere in the dark hours of the storm, sitting in this kitchen with this man, and she hadn't answered it then. She'd let it sit in the warm kitchen air between the unlit candles and the sound of rain. She was answering it now. "You'd have to be patient with me," she said. Her voice was steady, but something behind it wasn't. I'm not easy. I have things I carry, and I'm not always good at letting anyone help carry them. I keep moving when things get hard because moving is what I know. If I stay, I'm going to have to learn how to not do that, and I'm going to be bad at it sometimes. I've been bad at letting people help me for 2 years, he said. We'd be even. Something moved across her face, but not quite a smile, too complicated for that, but something real and unguarded. I want to keep cooking, she said. That's mine. I'm not giving that up. I wouldn't ask you to. And she paused, choosing, I need it to be real. Not me doing a job that happens to be domestic. I need it to be something we're both building, equal weight. Yes, he said, without hesitation. You say that now. I'll say it in March when it's 20 below and nothing's working right, he said. I'll say it then, too. She looked at her suitcase through the doorway. The ceramic mug was inside it, wrapped in a shirt, and she thought about unwrapping it and putting it back on the counter beside the coffee maker where it had been for 3 weeks. And the simplicity of that image, the mug on the counter, the place it had made for itself, was what undid her. Her eyes went bright. She didn't cry, not fully. She was not a woman who cried easily, and her body had apparently not gotten the message that this was an appropriate moment for it. But her eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the window for a moment. Okay, she said, quietly. Then again, with more of herself in it. Okay. Gavin let out a breath he'd apparently been holding. He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen. Not sweeping, not dramatic, just walked to where she was standing against the counter and stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. And he looked at her the way you looked at someone when you were deciding to trust the looking, to trust that what you saw was actually there and not a thing you'd invented out of need. He put his hand out, palm up, the way you offered something rather than took it. She put her hand in his. That was all. They stood in the kitchen of an old ranch house in October in Montana, and the morning light came through the window, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment didn't need words, and both of them had learned, the hard way, not to fill moments that didn't need filling. Then she said, I'm going to unpack my mug. And he said, good. And she did. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. They were something harder and realer than that. Two people with established damage learning to share space in ways that required constant, unglamorous adjustment. Rosalie stayed. That was the fact from which everything else followed. And it was a different kind of staying than she'd done before. The staying that came from deliberately choosing not to pack the suitcase rather than simply not having packed it yet. She'd made that distinction clearly to herself on the first morning after the conversation in the kitchen, standing in front of her unpacked bag and understanding that the difference between the two was the entire difference between moving through a life and living one. It was not seamless. The first week after the crew left, the ranch was very quiet. Just the two of them and the daily maintenance work that a ranch required even in its off-season. And the quiet was a different texture than the harvest quiet, more sustained, more revealing. They were navigating a space that had held 9 people and now held 2. And the reduction exposed things that the full house had insulated. Small incompatibilities. The friction of 2 people who'd been alone long enough to have calcified around their own habits. Gavin was bad at asking for help. He knew this about himself, and knowing didn't fix it. He would spend an hour on something that needed 2 sets of hands rather than say, "Can you hold this end?" And Rosalie, watching from a distance, learned to simply appear and take the other end without waiting to be asked, which annoyed him in a way that was also a relief. Rosalie was bad at letting things be unresolved. When something between them was off, even slightly, even in the minor way that 2 people were sometimes off because they were tired or cold or hadn't slept well, she needed to address it, needed to name it, needed to know it wasn't becoming something larger. Gavin, who processed things slowly and internally, found this pressure difficult and occasionally said so, and she occasionally pushed back. And they argued twice in the first 2 weeks. Real arguments. Not raised voices exactly, but the kind of argument where both people were saying true things that were also inconvenient and uncomfortable and necessary. The first argument was about the cattle rotation, which was ostensibly about the cattle, but was actually about whether she had standing to weigh in on ranch decisions that weren't strictly kitchen decisions. And after 20 minutes of going at it, they both arrived at the conclusion that she did, and he needed to get used to it, and she needed to not deliver her opinions like verdicts. The second argument was about Eleanor. That one was harder. Rosalie had found a photograph, not gone looking for it, simply found it on a shelf in the back room she was reorganizing because the shelves were a disaster. A photograph of Gavin and Eleanor on a summer day somewhere, laughing at something out of frame. She'd held it for a moment and then set it back on the shelf and not said anything. And later that night she'd been quieter than usual, and Gavin had eventually asked what was wrong, and she'd told him, plainly, that she'd found the photograph, and that she wasn't upset about the photograph exactly, but that she needed to understand whether Eleanor was something they were going to be able to talk about, or whether she was going to be a silence that lived in the house between them. He'd sat with that for a long moment. Then he'd gotten up and gone to the back room and come back with the photograph and set it on the kitchen table between them. He'd told her about the day it was taken, a county fair in August. Eleanor had won a pie competition and had been insufferably pleased about it for 2 weeks. He told it in the voice of a person talking about someone they loved without the word love, because the love was in every word around it. Rosalie had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "She sounds like she was wonderful," she said when he finished. "She was," he said. "She also left her shoes in the middle of the floor every single night for 11 years, and I tripped over them constantly, and she thought it was funny." He paused. "She wasn't a saint. She was a real person." "I know," Rosalie said. "That's why I asked." He put the photograph on the shelf in the hallway, where it could be seen. Not displayed prominently, not hidden away. Just present, the way the past was present. Not the whole of the room, but not erased from it either. Rosalie understood that completely. She'd started putting a small thing on the kitchen windowsill, a smooth river stone she'd had in her bag. One of those objects you acquired on the road and kept without fully understanding why, which she'd found in her pocket on the day Clara got sick and had been carrying ever since. She set it on the windowsill where the morning light hit it and said nothing about what it was, and Gavin looked at it once and didn't ask, and that too was its own kind of conversation. November came with snow, early and serious, and the ranch shifted into its winter posture. The long indoor work, the equipment maintenance, The checking of animals and structures, the particular rhythm of a Montana winter that was nothing like the harvest season's urgency, but had its own demands. Gavin and Hector worked through the maintenance list Gavin had been expanding for the past month, and Rosalie ran the house with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. And they both discovered gradually that the winter was not what either of them had feared. Gavin had feared the return of the particular emptiness, the winter dark arriving and the house closing in and the quiet becoming, again, the wrong kind. It didn't happen. The house was different now. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, and he wasn't pretending it was, but because the house had a person in it who was specifically, genuinely there. Not as a role, as herself. Rosalie moved through the winter house the way she moved through everything, with the unhurried competence of someone who'd decided this was where she was. And her being there was the difference between a house and a home in the precise and functional sense. A home was a place that held people who had decided to be held by it. Rosalie had feared herself. That was the honest version of it. She'd feared the version of herself that packed the suitcase when things got difficult, that put the mug in its shirt and latched the case and stood at the gate waiting for a ride, the version that had kept her moving for 4 years. She watched herself in the early weeks of November for signs of that impulse. The flinch, the itch to reduce commitment, the way she'd historically turned emotional weight into logistics because logistics could be managed and emotional weight couldn't. She felt it sometimes. She felt it on the bad nights, when she lay awake and the weight of Clara was very present, and the particular loneliness of that grief. The grief that had no one to share it with because it was hers and not part of any shared story, pressed on her in the dark. On those nights, something was different. On those nights, she could hear Gavin breathing on the other side of the wall. He was there. He was there the same way the mountains were there, without requiring anything of her, just present, just occupying the same ground, just a human being who knew what she carried and had not been frightened away by the weight of it. That was not a small thing. After years of managing her own weight alone, the proximity of someone who knew what was in the suitcase, literally and otherwise, and had asked her to stay anyway, was not a small thing. She stopped flinching from it, gradually, the way you stopped flinching from light when your eyes adjusted. On a Saturday in early December, Hector came by with his truck to drop off the parts Gavin had ordered for the tractor, and found the two of them in the barn disagreeing about the best way to store the baler for winter, which was exactly the kind of disagreement that was also not really about the baler. He unloaded the parts, observed the argument, and accepted the coffee Rosalie brought out to him with the air of a man settling in to watch something he'd been waiting to see. "You're both wrong about the baler," he said. "Turn it the other way. Weight distribution." They looked at him. "He's right," Rosalie said. "He's usually right," Gavin said, which was the closest he got to magnanimous. They turned the baler the other way. It sat better immediately. Gavin looked at it with the expression of a man accepting a correct answer. Hector drank his coffee and looked around the barn. The reorganized tool storage, the repaired wall, the general sense of a space that had been cared for recently, and then looked at the house through the open barn door, the new porch railing catching the thin winter light. "Good winter so far," he said. "Early," Gavin said. Still, Rosalie was rubbing her hands together against the cold, looking at the mountains. Hector looked at her and then at Gavin, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. He finished his coffee, put the mug on the workbench, and got back in his truck. Before he pulled away, he rolled down the window. "You need anything before Christmas? Call me," he said to Gavin. "I will." Hector looked at Rosalie. "Good to see you here," he said simply. She looked at him. "Good to be here," she said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of qualification, the absence of "for now" or "while it lasts," was its own kind of declaration. Hector drove away satisfied. Christmas came quietly. Gavin was not a Christmas man. He'd stopped making much of it after Eleanor died, had let it pass the way you let certain things pass when the person who made them meaningful was gone. He'd assumed this year would be similar. Rosalie did not share this assumption. She didn't overdo it. No excessive decorating, no performance of festivity that neither of them wanted. But there was a wreath on the door because she'd made one from branches she'd trimmed from the spruce at the edge of the yard. There was a particular dinner on Christmas Eve that took her most of the day, and that she refused to let him come into the kitchen for until it was ready. Beef short ribs braised low and slow since morning, potatoes done in the drippings. A bread she'd been working on all week that had turned out almost exactly right on the fourth try. She brought it to the table with the same matter-of-fact energy she brought to all cooking and said, "Sit down." And he sat down. He took the first bite and said nothing for a moment. "Rosalie." "I know," she said. "The bread's a little dense on the bottom. I'm going to fix the temperature next time." "That's not what I was going to say." She looked at him. "I was going to say thank you," he said. She looked at her plate. Something in her face was soft in a way she didn't try to manage. "You're welcome," she said. They ate dinner in the warm kitchen while the snow came down outside, and the ranch sat under it quietly, the way ranches sat under Montana winters, enduring, patient, built for exactly this. The mountains were invisible behind the weather. The yard was white and still. The porch railing had snow on it, a clean line of it along the new wood. Gavin looked at the window for a moment. "First winter in 2 years I'm not dreading January," he said. Rosalie looked at him. "What's in January?" "Nothing. That's why I dreaded it." He turned back to his plate. "Nothing in January, but cold and too much time." She understood that. She'd had her own version of January, the month of the calendar that had no particular associations attached to it, and was therefore the one where all the unattached grief piled up, unredeemed by any holiday or season marker. Just the pure, unmitigated fact of being in a life you hadn't fully chosen. "We'll figure out January," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not dreading it." There is something that happens to people who survive serious loss. Not all people, and not always, but sometimes, where the surviving of it becomes a kind of knowledge. Not wisdom, exactly, because wisdom implied you'd extracted a lesson and applied it cleanly, and loss didn't work that cleanly. But knowledge, yes. The specific knowledge of what was and wasn't worth protecting yourself from. The understanding that the walls you built after grief were useful up to a point, and after that point they were just walls, and walls kept things out without distinguishing between threats and the things worth having. Gavin had built very good walls. 2 years and 4 months of them, engineered with the thoroughness of a man who knew how to build things that held. He'd lived inside them and called it coping, and it had been coping, and also it had been, eventually, a kind of diminishment, the slow reduction of a life to its most manageable dimensions. Rosalie had moved instead of building walls, which was a different strategy with the same fundamental goal. Don't be in one place long enough to lose it. Keep the attachment loose enough that when you inevitably left, the thread pulled free clean. It was a reasonable strategy. It had kept her functional. It had also kept her from anything that required staying power. And staying power was what most of the real things required. They'd both, in different ways, been protecting themselves from a life that might hurt them. And the protection had worked. And the protection had also been costing them things they hadn't fully accounted for. The ordinary human requirement of being known, of being in a place that knew your name and your habits, and the sound of your footsteps in the hall, of mattering to a specific piece of ground and the people on it. You couldn't grief-proof a life. That was the thing they both now knew with the kind of certainty that only came from having tried. You could minimize your exposure, reduce your holdings, travel light, but loss found its way in regardless, and all you'd done in the meantime was make the life smaller without making the loss smaller. The loss was going to be what it was. The life could be larger than the fear of it. That was not a comfortable truth. It was not the kind of thing you arrived at and then lived with easily. It was a thing you had to decide again, regularly, some days more deliberately than others. Rosalie decided it every morning when she put the mug on the counter. Gavin decided it every morning when he sat down at the table. It was unglamorous. It was not once and done. It was a daily, imperfect, continued choice, and neither of them was always graceful about it, and neither of them was always right, and both of them were trying in the way that mattered. Not the performing of trying, but the actual grinding get-back-up version of it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Spring came late to the Flathead Valley that year, the way spring sometimes came to Montana. Reluctantly, in fits and starts, a warm week followed by a final cold snap that tested everyone's patience. The snow didn't fully leave the north pasture until the third week of April, but it left. And when it did, the ranch emerged from winter the way the ranch always emerged from winter. A little battered, ready for work, fundamentally intact. The fields were wet and dark and promising. The equipment Gavin and Hector had maintained through the cold months ran cleanly. The cattle were out in the lower pasture, moving around in the tentative way cattle moved after a long winter, as if reacquainting themselves with the concept of space. Gavin stood at the fence on the first genuinely warm morning of the year and looked out at the valley and felt the season turning under him, the way he'd felt it every spring of his life on this land. The particular biological alertness of a place waking up. The fields communicating something that wasn't quite language, but that a person who'd stood on the same ground long enough learned to read. He heard the back door open and close, and footsteps crossing the yard. And then Rosalie was standing beside him at the fence with 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one. They stood in the morning light and didn't talk for a while, which was one of the things they'd both discovered they were good at together. Sharing silence without it meaning anything was wrong, without anyone needing to fill it, just 2 people standing in the same place looking at the same thing. "Good year coming," she said eventually. He considered the fields, the sky, the mountains still white at the top but showing rock lower down, the snow retreating. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." She leaned her arms on the fence rail he'd repaired in the fall, solid now, going nowhere. "Hector said the Calloway brothers are coming back in June for the second cutting," she said. "They are. Clay Briggs, too, if he can get free from the ranch he's been working." "Good." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I like that crew." "They liked you better." She looked at him sideways. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." She almost smiled. "Pete Osgood called last week. Did I tell you?" "You told me." "He wanted to know if I'd made the peach cobbler again." "And?" "I told him to come by in August when the peaches were better." She looked back at the valley. "He said he would." Gavin drank his coffee. The morning was clear and cold, and the light was doing something particular to the mountains, the way light did in early spring. Everything sharper, the colors brighter than they'd been all winter, the land looking like itself again after the long, muffled months. He thought about the notice he'd tacked to the post at Dallow's Feed and Grain the previous fall. The bare, clipped language of it. No unnecessary conversation required. He'd meant it completely when he wrote it. He'd been certain, with the conviction of a man who'd thought things through, that what he needed was functional and contained. A cook, a season, nothing more. He'd been wrong in a way that he was profoundly, completely grateful for. The woman standing beside him at the fence, who had shown up in his driveway with a worn suitcase and a folded apron and her chin up and her eyes level, had done nothing more complicated than her job and been fully, completely herself while doing it. That was all. She hadn't fixed him. She hadn't rescued anyone. She'd cooked and worked and refused to be smaller than she was. And the simple fact of that, of a person insisting on their full existence in a space that had been shrinking around its only inhabitant, had made the space viable again. He'd done the rest himself. That mattered. She would have told him it mattered, and he'd learned over the winter that she was right about most things. "Rosalie," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you answered that notice." She looked at him for a moment. That particular clear regard she had, the one that looked at you and didn't look away from what it saw. "I almost didn't," she said. "I read it in the store and I put it in my pocket and I threw it away that night." He turned to look at her. "What changed your mind?" She was quiet for a moment. "Dale Sutter," she said. "He found me at the counter the next morning and said the man who posted it was a good man who'd had a hard couple of years and needed someone capable, and that the valley could use more people willing to show up for the hard stretches." She paused. "He said it like he was talking about the job, but I think he was talking about more than the job." Gavin looked back at the valley. He was going to have a word with Dale Sutter the next time he was in town. Not a negative word. The morning moved around them, the cattle in the lower pasture, the mountains letting go of their snow, the fields of the Mercer Ranch sitting in the spring light doing what fields did in April in Montana, which was fill up with possibility. Somewhere to the north, a pair of hawks was working the updraft above the ridge, turning in long, slow circles, rising without apparent effort. Gavin watched them for a moment. Then he finished his coffee, put the mug on the fence post, and turned toward the barn. "Let's get to work." he said. Rosalie drank the last of her coffee, set her mug beside his, and fell into step beside him. The ranch was waking up. There was a great deal to do, and both of them knew how to do it, and neither of them was doing it alone. That was the whole story. It wasn't more complicated than that, and it wasn't less.